I've produced over 1,000 songs in my 5-year journey as a music producer, and most of them are garbage. However, after I looked at all my songs and then picked out the best of them, I was able to figure out what separated those from the bad ones. And what was it? 2 words: chord progressions. You probably thought you could get away with knowing no music theory at all. And I hate to break it to you, but you can't. Let me explain. Knowing no music theory is kind of like jogging barefoot. It certainly works and it doesn't hurt that much, nor do you have to pay any money or do any research to figure out what shoes are the best. But if you're anything like me, I'd just go for the shoes, honestly. That's why in this video, we're gonna go through everything about chords, from the basics to augmented, diminished, major, seventh. Let's start with the basics. Practically every time I create a chord, I start with the root note. The root note is the bottom note of a standard triad. It's commonly referred to as the bass note. The chord is named after the root note. So for example, a C major has the C note as its root note. Let's just place a C and use that as our root note. Great. Now let's look at the 5th. The 5th is the top note. It's the note you normally hear the most. But before I can show you how to place the 5th, you have to know what a semitone is. To visualize what it is, look at a piano. The keys are arranged in a repeating pattern of white and black keys. Each white key and black key is one semitone apart from its neighbor. For example, if you play a white key, say C, and then the very next key to the right, which is a black key called C sharp, you can then say you have moved up 1 semitone. So to give an example, if we start at C and want to move up 2 semitones, we can count 1, C sharp, and then 2, D. So every key on this piano is 1 semitone. Great. Now let's look at 5ths again. The 5th is 7 semitones above the root note. So let's count. That's the 5th. Now let's look at thirds. The 3rd is the middle note. It's the note that adds flavor and determines if a chord is a major or a minor. We'll get back to that shortly. The 3rd in a major chord is 4 semitones up from the root note. And in a minor chord, it's 3 semitones. The most important thing to take away from that is that basically every chord out there consists of a root note, a 3rd, and a 5th. That's basically what a triad is. Now let's look at major and minor. This is a chord and this is a chord. Do you notice a difference? I'd be slightly worried if I didn't notice a difference here. You guessed it, it's the middle note, also called the 3rd. So like I said, the 3rd determines if the chord is a major or a minor. Let's start by explaining the major. So here are every topics you need to know to understand a major chord. Let's begin by explaining how it's built up. Let's make an F major this time. I start by placing the root note, and because it's a major chord, I move up with 4 semitones. And then 3 more to the 5th. Easy, that's an F major. Let's move on to sound. Everyone agrees that a major chord sounds happy. Just have a listen. Sounds happy, so that must mean that it's not in sad songs, right? Well, not exactly. And that brings me on to the next point, the use of it. The major chord is used in practically every chord progression, like this one, which doesn't sound happy even though it contains 2 major chords. Okay, great. Now let's talk about minor. So here are all the topics about minors this time. Let's begin with how it's built up. Let's have the D sharp as our root note this time. Then we'll count 7 semitones up for the 5th. Now the 3rd in a minor is 3 semitones up. Great, a D sharp minor. Let's move on to the sound of it. Most people would say the minor sounds sad. Let's have a listen to it. It does sound a bit sad. Now let's hear it in context. This also sounds kinda sad, but if you've ever heard Stamp on the Ground, you'll hear that it uses the same type of chord progression that I do here, yet still sounds happy. So rhythm and sounds in general matters a lot. But if chords don't determine if a song sounds happy or sad, what determines it then? Scales. There are a lot of scales in music, but pretty much the only ones I use are the major and the minor. Now, as you've probably understood, major is happy, minor is sad. The same applies to scales. The scale plays a major role in determining the mood of your track. And in order to explain how a scale is built up, I'm going to use something called whole steps and half steps. It's really simple. A whole step is 2 semitones and a half step is 1. And I'm going to use the letters W for whole step and H for half step. Let's begin with the major scale again. This is how you would write any major scale. Let's create the C major scale now. In order to do that, we have to start at the C. So as a whole step is the same as moving up by 2 semitones, we're gonna end up at the D note. Then we're gonna move up another whole step to E, and for this one, we're only gonna move up by one semitone, because it's a half step. I think you understand how it works now, so I'm just gonna fill the rest out now. Great, that's the C major scale. Now let's say I were to pitch this 2 semitones up, then I would have a D major. So if you ever want to find out the major scale, just begin at the lowest note, then use this recipe and count up. The minor scale works exactly the same, only it uses this recipe instead. Let's create the C minor scale now using the recipe above. We'll start at C since it's a C minor. Then we'll move a whole step or 2 semitones up. The next one after that is a half step. So then we'll go up to the D sharp. Let's quickly fill out the rest. There, that's the C minor scale. So now you understand that if you want a sad track, use minor, and if you want a happy track, use major. Let me show you how you can set up FL Studio for scales now. Open an instrument track. Then you navigate up to the arrow on the upper left, then click on Stamp. Now you have all these different scales to choose from. I'll just pick minor melodic for the sake of the tutorial. Then just choose the root of the scale you want. If I want a D minor scale, for example, I click on D. There, now you have the scale in the piano roll. Additionally, I recommend opening a sampler channel, then putting the scale in there, in all octaves. Then, when you move back to your piano layer, you'll have ghost notes that you can use to stay in scale. Just stay within your scale when creating your melodies and chord progressions, then you'll achieve your desired mood. Here I've chosen a scale and placed some root notes. Let me show you how to use your newfound info in practice. Start by placing the third. We know the first chord has to be a major, as the minor third wouldn't be in scale. Same concept here, but here the major third wouldn't be in scale. Great, now all we have to do is place the fifth, which will always be 7 semitones above the root note. That's a chord progression, but it's not great. Let me show you a few tricks that take your chord progressions from sounding like crap to sounding pretty good. Copying the root note. Okay, so I've made this chord progression now. Let's listen to it. It sounds extremely thin, so let's copy the bass note down an octave. Sounds a lot better already, but we've got a lot more tricks up our sleeve. Chord inversions. If you tried playing this progression on a piano, you'd have a hard time switching between these chords, for example, as the notes are so far apart. So what we can do is just move the A note an octave down so it's closer to the rest of the chords. Do this for all notes that stand out in your progression, and you'll have a much more realistic sound. The next trick is adding tiny melodies in your progressions. Try to make your progressions more dynamic and change them up here and there, as well as adding a few notes here and there to make it more melodic. You don't have to do this, but sometimes it improves your chords and might spark some inspiration. This one is a bit more advanced, but really easy when you understand it. It's called diminished chords. Let's start by creating a diminished chord on its own. I'll start by placing the root note and then counting up 3 semitones like in a minor. Now here comes the unique part. We're going to count 3 semitones up from here as well. That's a diminished chord. It sounds horrible on its own, but in context, it works great. The only places you can put a diminished chord is where 2 chords are separated only with 1 semitone. Like these 2, for instance. Build the diminished around the semitone that's between these root notes. Let's listen to it now. That sounds great, but don't overdo it. Only have it as a switch up here and there. The final step for this particular chord progression is humanizing it. There are many ways to humanize a progression, but the things I normally do is adding the strum effect and changing the velocity. Press Alt or Options, plus S to open the strumizer. There you can mess with the settings until you're satisfied. I like to just have it on a pretty low setting, but it depends on what track I'm creating. Then, in order to humanize the velocity. Ideally play it on a piano, but if you can't, then just do some random adjustments to the velocity. Great, now let's go through a couple of other tips that I didn't include in this progression. Cluster chords. This is a cluster chord where two notes are next to each other, creating suspense and tension. Sevenths and ninths. A seventh is just a standard triad, plus the seventh note in the scale, thereby the name seventh. As this is a major chord, we have to count in the major scale as well. That's a major seventh. If it was a minor chord, we would have to do the same, but in the minor scale instead. The ninth is the same concept, only counting 9 notes in the scale this time. As this is a minor chord, we have to also count in the minor scale. Finally, there's the third inversion trick. Here I've made a progression. It sounds good, but sometimes we want more energy in our chords. So what we do in order to achieve that is copy all these thirds an octave up, like this. This makes them more energetic in my opinion. I hope these tricks helped you out. If it did, please consider liking and subscribing. Thanks for watching.